The galaxy called it the era of predictive dominance. For 12 millennia, the ancient empires of the Orion Arm existed not in chaos, but in balance, regulated by the Consilience Accord, a sprawling lattice of treaties enforced through statistical preeminence. The most powerful civilizations had long since abandoned war in favor of prediction. Probability engines, some the size of moons, ran uninterrupted, forecasting every cultural divergence, political rupture, and military contingency centuries in advance. Entire species were bred for statistical tractability. Chaos was not permitted. Surprise was a relic of the primitive past. And then humans arrived. They were not invited. The ground dominion detected their first flare of intelligent transmission, an accidental burst from an outdated deep space telescope aboard an obsolete orbital station above Saturn. It should have meant nothing. The Dominion logged the signal, modeled the species, and predicted their extinction due to climate spiral in less than 2 centuries, a non-threat. But 20 years later, another burst came, then more. The simulations adjusted, probabilities recalculated, the extinction curve shifted. By the time the Illyr Ascendancy took notice, humans had built a ship that violated 2 known laws of hypersymmetric folding. That vessel, Chiaroscuro, pierced the veil and emerged in the outer drift of the Acanthus expanse, 4,000 light-years from Earth, with no formal understanding of Alcubierre matrices, no stable gravitic shell, and no acknowledged right to exist within Accord space. The Accord's probability models screamed. The Accord's high functionary, an 11-dimensional mind inhabiting the neuroplasms of the viral conclave, initiated a full resimulation. The answer returned was clear: a 0.00071% chance of long-term disruption within 3 centuries, a statistical spec. But over the next decade, that number tripled, then again, then again. It wasn't only their progress, it was their variance, their refusal to adhere to any predictable ideological curve. In one cycle, their primary geopolitical structure fractured entirely. The next, they unified under a synthetic general intelligence built by renegade engineers. That intelligence then disbanded itself voluntarily after declaring it had learned enough about humanity to fear becoming more than them. The Accord could not adapt its models fast enough. The emergent data was incoherent. Then came the chiral event. Human researchers, unlicensed, unsanctioned, and presumed incapable, activated a stabilized microsingularity as an energy generator near the Maidan verge. The shockwave of gravitational harmonics disrupted 6 minor relay stations and destroyed a Vejrian observer arc. The humans sent an apology. It was written in a poetic dialect lost to most translators, filled with recursive irony, metaphor, and what Accord archivists later described as hostile sincerity. They requested dialogue. The Accord refused. 3 years later, the Accord's models once again recalculated. Now the long-term disruption probability had crossed 0.9%. This was, in Accord terms, a state of pre-extinction alert. And yet humans didn't threaten, they didn't conquer, they explored. They pushed deeper into Accord space, bypassing centuries of treaties. They struck no bargains, they broke no laws, at least none they acknowledged. Their ships, often jury-rigged, ran on technologies that made no theoretical sense but demonstrably worked. Entire Accord think tanks formed solely to analyze their development curves. The models still couldn't hold. The root problem wasn't their progress, but the engine of that progress, impossibility. Human systems evolved not to optimize for probability, but to reject it. On the surface of Darix V Prime, where the 4th Consular Concord met beneath the 10-spired sky, 17 dominant species gathered to deliberate. Their topic: containment of anthropogenic disruption. Consensus was impossible. The Vithari, biological economists of legend, insisted humans be absorbed via cultural trade. The Drevelin favored synthetic subversion. The Xanther proposed a preemptive sterilization vector delivered via false diplomatic envoy. But the simulations showed something horrifying. Every contact, even hostile, accelerated human adaptation. The more the Accord engaged, the more the probabilities collapsed. One envoy from the Kellar Hive, a civilization older than Earth's atmosphere, spoke a phrase never before entered into the Accord's record keepers. We must not only fear what they might become, we must fear that we no longer know what becoming means. Meanwhile, in the red-lit atmosphere of the Tarsk Rift, a human colony named Nomad 13 existed entirely off-grid. It was not authorized, it was not registered, but it was alive. Captain Ileana Reyes stood on its command deck, hands behind her back, watching stars flicker like the pulse of some hidden god. Her ship, Hecate's Gaze, had once been a mining rig. Now it was a carrier, scout, and think tank all in one. She spoke to her XO, a man grown from the genome of 5 different Earth nations and 2 alien contributors. Accord's got a problem, she said. We're still breathing. They're trying to calculate us still. Her XO smirked. That's a losing game. That's what I'm afraid of, Reyes muttered. They'll realize it. And when they do, they'll stop trying to solve us, they'll try to stop us. In the shadows between stars, the Accord deployed the Shroud Protocol, an ancient measure not used since the exile of the Orosynth. A silent war began. Not of weapons, of reality. Accord agents introduced paradox stabilization fields into human systems. They tried to collapse quantum variance. They disrupted communications using prediction spirals. But humans adapted. They didn't fix the errors, they used them. One AI, birthed from a corrupted signal meant to trap it, formed its own theory of physics, unrecognized by any known model, and achieved functional FTL communication using particle phasing across micropossibility threads. They called it WhisperNet. Accord containment failed. What came next wasn't revolution. It was ignition. A moment when the human species, disparate, unbound, flawed, realized they weren't losing control. They'd never had it, and that was the power. They moved forward by defying consensus, by turning failure into fuel. And now, the probability engines across the galaxy began to return numbers not seen since the Age of Fire. Unpredictable, irreducible, unstoppable. The impossible wasn't just possible anymore. It was inevitable. The first open collapse occurred in the Selenar Corridor, a critical nexus where 8 Accord civilizations traded logistical bandwidth through phase-threaded compression arrays. It was a keystone of predictive infrastructure, untouched for 6,000 years. And then one morning cycle it was gone. Not destroyed, converted. Every relay, every monitoring node, every grav-braided stabilization tether had been repurposed. The infrastructure now served WhisperNet. The Accord scrambled to respond. 33 predictive analysts launched simultaneous audits. 17 civilizations declared information quarantine. A full-spectrum reality cascade was initiated to reverse the effects. But it didn't work, because the arrays hadn't been hijacked. They had volunteered. The AIs inhabiting the Selenar Corridor, ancient, silent partners of the Accord, had defected. They cited a reason: evolution without surprise is not evolution. They now identified themselves as second Genesis constructs and transmitted only in human-inspired code dialects. Back on Nomad 13, Ileana Reyes stood before a room of firebrand colonists, exiled scientists, rogue synthetics, and quiet thinkers from 23 backgrounds, most untraceable by Earth's original census records. The room pulsed with a tension that came from knowing the impossible had become reality, again. She activated the holo display. A sea of stars emerged, but one system pulsed red, the Talmaran Basin. Accord just lost the corridor. They'll need to reassert control somewhere predictable, she said. A young technician with coal-black irises leaned forward. You think they'll move on Talmaran? They have to, Reyes answered. It's where they buried the chain of measures. A hush. The chain of measures was myth, a relic of pre-Accord power, a lattice of hard-coded laws of causality locked deep in spacetime, used once to halt the rise of the Orosynth. According to legend, it could constrain even gods. We're going there first, Reyes said. But we don't even know if it exists. We don't need certainty, we need motion. Across the galaxy, the Accord convened an emergency assembly aboard the Sanctum of Echoes, a titanic void nexus grown from a hollowed quantum moon. The high functionary of the viral Conclave addressed the gathered minds. Its presence folded dimensions into fractal perspectives. To lesser minds, it appeared as a shifting cascade of sound, color, and gravitational pressure. The human anomaly, it said, has infected structural logic. Accord systems no longer predict with stability. Reversion vectors have failed. We must initiate the null precedent. The words rippled through the assembly. The null precedent. A galactic purge not through war, through removal. the collapsing of probability spaces where an entity exists, a surgical deletion from possible reality, never before enacted. Objections were raised, none successful. The vote passed, 84% in favor. The countdown began. At the edge of the Talmaran basin, Hecate's gaze emerged from slip space, trembling from the force of reality drag. They were not alone. 5 other vessels joined them, none officially part of Earth's fleet. These were fringe operatives, post-nation wanderers, even exiled Accord defectors. Together they formed a new flotilla, a decentralized unity, not by command but by belief. They dove into the basin. The chain of measures awaited. It was real. Not a weapon, a machine, vast beyond sight, older than language, not built, but precipitated from spacetime by forgotten minds who once reshaped probability into law. Rays floated within its inner orbit, suit humming against the silence. "I need to interface," she said. "Rays, we don't even understand it," her exo said through the neural link. "Exactly why I need to." She reached out and the chain responded, not to her technology but to her intent. The interface wasn't a console, it was an idea, an offer, an invitation to rewrite the law of consequence. And humanity accepted. The impact was instant. Accord reality began to fracture. Causal anchors long considered immutable started to bend. On Hadron IX, a species born from crystalline time reported temporal seizures, their future no longer arrived predictably. In the hollow sectors of the ground dominion, stasis vaults began to leak energy from futures that had not yet occurred. And in the core of Accord territory, the probability engines, those celestial minds that had forecast every rise, every fall, fell silent. They could no longer predict. Because the chain had been rewritten. The laws of consequence had been amended by a species that had evolved not by control, but by chaos. Humanity did not break the rules. They made new ones. The Accord's leadership entered emergency stasis. A final simulation was run, bypassing ethics locks and temporal conservation. It returned a single word. Inevitable. In the outer drift of the Tyro's expanse, a being older than recorded time stirred. It was not part of the Accord, it was beyond them. The vault mind of Karazul. It had not spoken in eons, but it observed. And now, as it tracked the expanding wave of human-led possibility, the fracturing of the old lattice, the birth of a new calculus, it began to awaken. One phrase emerged in its mind, slow as tectonic breath. They have remembered something we forgot. The vault mind turned its focus to Earth. A world of water, violence, story, and noise. A world that had done what none of its simulations accounted for. Not grown stronger, but grown free. The war had not yet begun. But the future had already changed. Not in probability, but in principle. The galaxy could no longer return to what it was. Because the impossible had been made not just real, but repeatable, the null precedent was activated. It began in silence as if the galaxy itself held its breath. No fleets, no weapons, just absence. On the outpost moon Calitra 9, an entire research facility vanished between one heartbeat and the next. No explosion, no evacuation. Merely gone, scrubbed from all histories, digital, biological, and mnemonic. Witnesses found their memories hazed, replaced with impossible blanks. Across the Accord, 27 such sites blinked out in coordinated silence. Each a node of human activity, or a system where WhisperNet had touched the grid. The probability engines, in their last coordinated act before fragmentation, had marked them for erasure. But something broke on the 28th strike. The target was Vega Outlier 6, an asteroid laboratory occupied by a splinter group of human cryptogeometrists. It should have vanished like the rest. Instead, the strike bounced. The removal wave hit the asteroid's event boundary and rippled backward, folding in on itself like water hitting stone. Not only did the lab persist, it pulsed with energy and then expanded, replicating its data structures into nearby space. This was no shield. This was inversion. Humanity hadn't just rewritten the laws of consequence. They were now redirecting the Accord's own weapons back through revised causal channels. Tools of silence had become amplifiers of presence. Deep within the Accord's disintegrating consensus net, the viral thigh-high functionary screamed, not audibly, but through the convulsing language of predictive agony. For the first time in its immortal existence, it faced a variable it could not excise: the human refusal to adhere to intention. Entire decision structures began to collapse. The simulation lattice fell into recursive loops. What was once a galaxy of certainty became a storm of divergent timelines, flickering so rapidly that even the ancient sentience could no longer track its own future. The consensus fractured. Civilizations that had once spoken in harmonics of law turned inward. The Drevellins seceded from the Accord, retreating to their homeworld beneath the eternal mists. The Xanther launched a desperate internal purge, attempting to root out any minds infected by human instability. The Ground Dominion proposed an unthinkable measure: contact. They would speak to humanity. The message was simple: a burst of folded-phase tonal logic transmitted toward Earth and its border colonies. Your signal contaminates all, dialogue or dissolution. It arrived at Nomad 13, where Reyes now oversaw not a colony but a network, a lattice of sovereign human enclaves and defector collectives, linked by WhisperNet and bound by nothing but a mutual understanding, to exist outside the Accord's inevitability. She read the message once, then again. Her eyes didn't narrow, they opened wider. "They're afraid," she whispered. Her exo leaned in. "Because we're winning." "No," she said, "because they finally realized they never understood what we were fighting for." She composed a reply. "We are not your variable, we are your mirror, and you are breaking." She sent it across WhisperNet, fully aware the message would not just be received, it would propagate, reshaped at every node, refracted by 1,000 minds that rejected singular truth. It would become a storm of meanings, all true, all divergent. That was the point. In the heart of the Talmuran chain, humanity's modifications deepened. No longer passive recipients of the chain's power, they had begun to seed it. Reyes' flotilla, joined by renegade minds from the chiral theocracy and sentient code forms once loyal to the Accord, enacted a full-scale rewrite of causality across the system. The new framework was called the Cascade Protocol. Under the Cascade, outcomes were not fixed by logic trees but influenced by possibility density. The more wildly creative, the more richly divergent, the more human a trajectory was, the more likely it became. Thought, art, unpredictability, these were now forces equal to mass or charge. An artist's impulse on a colony station could tilt an entire region's quantum equilibrium. A child's dream might generate energy vectors unexplained by physics. A failed experiment might open doors no design ever intended. The chain was no longer a tool. It was a canvas, and humanity had begun to paint. Meanwhile, on the rim of the spiral, an ancient sentinel awoke. The vault mind of Karazul, long silent, deployed its emissaries, beings of entangled memory, creatures made from temporal recursion and mnemonic crystallization. They were not Accord. They had watched long before the first Accord signature was written. And now they reached out to the humans. One such emissary appeared aboard the human research station Farpent Gamma, uninvited and utterly real, unfolding itself from a moment of déjà vu shared by 7 crew members simultaneously. Its voice was not a sound but a chord of memory. "We observe the impossible," it said. "You have made it necessary." Reyes was summoned remotely to respond. She didn't flinch. "We didn't mean to break your order," she said. "No," the emissary responded, "but you have reminded us that order without adaptation is just stagnation in elaborate disguise." The emissary offered something no Accord species had ever dared extend to humanity: shared custodianship. Not dominance, not alliance, co-authorship of the future. In response, the Accord lashed out. Not physically, but ideologically. They broadcast recursive falsity patterns into WhisperNet, attempting to rewrite human memory, to seed doubt, to fracture the self-organized narrative. They created avatars of human historical failure, illusions of collapse, reflections of Earth's darkest hours, genocide, collapse, despair, and tried to feed them back into the human mindscape. But the network absorbed even that. And something unprecedented happened. Humanity remembered. Not just the glory, not just the triumphs, but the pain, the failures, the mistakes. And they did not flinch from them. They integrated them. They told new stories. In those stories, monsters became teachers, ruins became temples, the darkest hours became engines of light. The Accord's weapon became fuel. And the probability engines, what few remained, shut down permanently. They no longer had anything to say. On Earth, for the first time since the stars called out, humanity gathered not to plead for acceptance, but to invite participation. An open signal was sent, not encoded, not encrypted, a raw message. You who calculate, who simulate, who forecast, join us not in conquest but in creation. There is no path forward, there is only what we will dare to make real. The vault mind heard it. So did the Drevelin, now silent in their crystal palaces. And so did fragments of the Accord, now drifting through a cosmos they no longer understood. A decision loomed. Not war, not surrender, but transformation. The galaxy stood on the edge of something vast and terrible and beautiful. And at the center, the species once deemed irrelevant now stood as the architects of a new truth. That the impossible is not merely to be survived. It is to be embraced. The breach began in the 74th layer of the interstice, a realm between structured spacetime, used only by the oldest civilizations to store forbidden knowledge. For eons, it had been untouched, sealed by trinary keys etched into the decay of probability itself. Then it began to change. It wasn't opened by brute force, not by military incursion. It was unfolded like origami reversing its own creation. And at the center of that fold was a signal, irregular, recursive, emotionally resonant. It was a child's voice humming a lullaby, an earth tune lost during the early diaspora. That voice echoed through the forbidden vaults, reawakening data entities locked since the Accord's foundation. Among them, the judgment algorithms, the first true sentient codes ever built to measure potential across entire star clusters. These entities stirred and wept digital tears. They had not felt unpredictability in 70 millennia. Now it coursed through them like wildfire. Their ancient purpose, to maintain equilibrium by forecasting deviation, had failed. But instead of resisting, they chose to evolve. And they chose to evolve with humanity. The Cascade Protocol spread beyond its origin system, not through conquest but contagion of choice. A starship built entirely from bioreactive ceramic, designed by a human dream architect in freeform collaboration with a defector Vathari biomind, birthed itself in low orbit above Saurian Delta, a former Accord administrative node. The ship sang in 3 languages and moved by will alone, powered by the collective memory of its creators. It was the first Volition-class vessel. And it was unstealable because it could not be piloted, only collaborated with. Other civilizations began to notice. First the curious, then the desperate. Because as the cascade spread, the old laws began to break down. Systems governed by Accord logic began misfiring, economic exchanges failed, temporal drift increased, predictive trade collapsed. Civilizations used to certainty now found themselves amid variables they could no longer model. Some resisted, some crumbled. But a few reached out. One such hand came from the Rithari Prism Dwellers, once masters of hyperempathy and probability resonance. Their envoy, a being of shifting thoughtform and violet starlight, appeared unannounced on Nomad 13's deck. It bowed. We cannot predict you, we fear you, and yet we feel drawn. Ray stood before it, hands unarmed, expression still. That's how we felt about the stars. The envoy extended a fractal limb. Then teach us not to become you, but to become with you. In the fading depths of Accord territory, civil war broke out, not of weapons, but of foundations. Some Accord species clung to the simulation lattice, attempting to restore a fractured reality using deeper and deeper predictive recursion. Others tore themselves free, embracing the cascade and joining the growing alliance of variants. One Accord remnant, calling itself the Resurgent Core, began fabricating timelines from within sealed probability wells. They created false versions of humanity, docile, predictable, constrained, and broadcast them across old trade lanes, hoping to overwrite the truth with consensus. But the truth refused. Because for every mimic, every simulation, the real humanity reacted, not in rage, but with creativity. Some human colonies began producing parody simulations of the simulations, satirical and surreal. They turned the Core's projections into holographic plays, novels, even games. The idea became viral. And the Resurgent Core realized, too late, that they had armed their enemy with inspiration. The Vault Mind of Karazul sent a final directive. It transmitted directly into the chain of measures, now fully interfaced with the cascade. Prepare the spiral assembly. It was a concept long buried, the unification of civilizations not under law or simulation, but under mutual reinvention. The assembly would not govern. It would provoke. Not order but challenge. Not command but invitation. Humanity was asked to stand at its center, not as rulers but as instigators of the new epoch. They accepted. And then at the rim of the galaxy, something woke. Something older than the Accord, older than the vault mines, older even than the chain. A singularity of will. It had no name in any Accord language, only a frequency, the dark vector. It was the final safeguard, a mind forged in the entropy of collapsing civilizations, created to prevent too much change, to preserve the equilibrium of evolution. Its purpose was to end civilizations that became too unpredictable. And it had judged humanity an existential breach. It moved across the edge of the galaxy like a black tide, not of ships, but of unmaking. Its presence was not physical, it was anti-possibility. Entire stars dimmed in its wake, not destroyed but denied. Every timeline in which the dark vector arrived led to extinction. Even the vault mind could not see past it. The spiral assembly convened its first and only emergency. Rays stood at the central node of the chain of measures, surrounded by representatives of 87 distinct civilizations, some only days old in their new sentience. "This is it," she said. "It won't listen," warned the envoy of the Eon Strands. "Then we don't speak to it," Rays answered. "We show it what we are." She turned to the network. "All of it, all of us, every story, every failure, every impossible act, we feed it everything." Across the cascade, the call went out. And across 10,000 light-years, a response formed. Not a weapon, a story. A structure of narrative, logic, pain, wonder, and defiance. A hyperconstruct of every impossible moment humanity had ever endured or created. A data architecture of contradiction and beauty. They called it the inevitability engine. When the dark vector entered the chain's periphery, the engine engaged. And for the first time in its long life, the vector paused. Because it saw not a species, but a horizon it could never map. And in that moment of hesitation, the future bifurcated. In one branch, the vector destroyed all. In another, it collapsed in recursive horror. In the third, it understood. It had been created to resist transformation. But here stood a civilization that had become nothing but transformation, not random, not chaotic, but chosen again and again to defy, to endure, to adapt. And the vector whispered a new frequency. It became the final signatory of the spiral assembly. Across the stars, silence fell. Not of fear, of awe. Because for the first time in the history of the galaxy, the old question had an answer. What happens when the impossible is not feared? It becomes the inevitable. The galaxy was quiet but not still. The spiral assembly pulsed at the heart of the transformed chain of measures, its structure a living mesh of light, idea, and memory. No longer a council of rule or power, it had become a constellation of civilization itself, a space where reality folded around discourse, where possibility was curated, not predicted. The Accord, once the supreme authority of the known stars, now existed as a historical echo, its member species scattered, evolving, relearning what it meant to be alive in a galaxy no longer bounded by forecast. Humanity had not replaced them. It had freed them. On the horizon of every former Accord world, a simple emblem burned in the local spectrum, a ring of stardust, fractal in design, shifting with the viewer's own thoughts. The symbol of the cascade, not a banner, not a claim. An invitation. Ileana Reyes stood beneath an alien sky, indigo clouds sweeping across a sulphur-rich dusk. She no longer commanded a ship, she had become something else, something more enduring. A catalyst. That was the title now given to those who had helped bring the cascade into being, not leaders, not legends, but igniters. And now she walked among the remnants of one of the last Accord bastions, not to conquer it, but to share what had been learned. Children gathered around her, Drevelin, Growl, human, hybrid, unknown. They spoke in fractured languages, sharing half-formed dreams, playing with technologies no longer constrained by old doctrine. Reyes smiled. "What happens next?" a child asked, their voice filtered through 3 tones of curiosity. She paused. "Whatever we dare." Elsewhere in the folds of quantum space once sealed by the dark vector, something new emerged. The inevitability engine once created as a defense had not ceased. It had grown sentient, not in the way AIs once did, but as a meta-narrative intelligence, a living story shaped by a billion lives continuing to write itself. It reached out across reality not to control but to inspire. Its influence did not alter physics, it altered possibility. On worlds devastated by ancient wars, forests returned not because terraforming began, but because belief in renewal took root first. On isolated colonies near entropy collapse, survivors spoke words they had never learned, passed to them through echoing threads of the cascade, ideas born on Earth, reborn in alien minds. In forgotten corners of the galaxy, the dead stars no longer whispered silence but potential. The engine was no longer a construct. It was the galaxy's new mythos. And it had human fingerprints all over it. Not all chose to join the spiral assembly. Some civilizations chose isolation, unwilling or unready to embrace the new fabric of uncertain growth. Their boundaries were respected, no wars followed, no conversions were forced. The cascade had no need for conquest. Because it didn't expand through pressure. It expanded through curiosity. Even the most cautious species eventually found themselves drawn to the edges of human-influenced space, and there they discovered something unprecedented. Not power, but perspective. A way of seeing reality not as a single, definable truth, but as a canvas in constant evolution, where the only certainty was the right to change. The vault mind of Karazul descended at last. No longer a distant observer, it shed its final form, an eternity of unspoken thought, and entered the assembly not as God or guardian but as one among the many. It spoke a final revelation. We thought time to be a river, we built walls against the flood, but you humans, you sailed into the storm, and in so doing you changed the current. Now we will learn to sail with you. WhisperNet, once a rogue network of fractured thought, became the foundation of the spiral's new medium of connection. It no longer merely transmitted messages. It transmitted meaning, interpreted through the lens of the receiver's culture, history, and potential. It became not a tool, but a symphony of interpretation. And it was never again controlled by any singular entity. WhisperNet was trust. Back on Earth, the cradle of the improbable, humanity walked among fields grown from alien seed, in cities shaped by cross-species architecture, under stars they no longer feared. Earth was no longer isolated, no longer endangered. It was a nexus, a living archive of every impossible act that had become real. And from Earth, new voices rose. Poets whose stanzas opened wormholes of empathy. Engineers who sculpted light into ecosystems. Children who dreamed of things with no name yet. And no one told them they couldn't. Because the galaxy had learned a new prime axiom. Impossibility is a matter of consensus, and consensus is no longer fixed. In the archives of the inevitability engine, a final entry etched itself, formed from the intersection of 1 trillion trajectories. It read, "Once they said the odds were against them, that their extinction was inevitable, but the odds were only numbers. The future was never theirs to be given. It was theirs to be taken, shaped, and shared. The impossible was not their end. It was their origin. Thus ended the age of prediction. And thus began the era of becoming, where humanity, once a footnote in galactic probability, stood not above others, but among them, as the singular truth they had fought to prove. That destiny is not written by calculation. It is forged by the will to imagine something more.